Football Manager is a lot of fun.
Low into the middle. Magnificent!
I love taking teams nobody has ever heard of and trying to turn them into world beaters.
He's got himself an absolute peach.
But there's a problem with the game.
To look up and into a position of real strength. Oh, how good is he?
Well, the problem with Football Manager is that it's pay to win. Now, I'm not talking about real-life microtransactions. No, I'm talking about the way that the economy in the game actually works. If your team has more money, it'll do better. It's as simple as that. And there are only so many ways you can make money in this game. So let's take a deeper look at how Football Manager finances work. Now, when most of us think about the budgets, we think about this stuff, the transfer and wage budgets. Stay within the wage budget and don't go into debt for transfers and you'll be fine. Actually, you can use installments without too much of a penalty, provided that you're careful. Now trust me, I've made mistakes and done it the wrong way. If you buy the best possible young players using long-term installments, even winning the league and being promoted several times in a row will likely not be enough to save your finances. And the game will let you make really ridiculous deals, it won't stop you. But of course, there's more to budgets than just wages and transfer budgets and installments. You see, the thing is that you want your club to make a bunch of revenue, and you want to keep these expenses down. If that happens, you'll get more transfer budget money in the future. But the big question is how in the world you can do that, and it's not as simple as you might think. Here's your typical income screen. Look at the categories that you have. Now, players sold is obvious. You can always sell your good players to raise more money. But you need players to actually play the game, so you don't want to sell all of your good players, just the ones that you don't need. Or if you're like me, you just sell the ones that piss you off. You can influence season tickets, but only very gradually. Winning a lot will get more people to come to your matches. If your team can't win, they won't come. You're not going to be able to do much about TV revenue unless you can get promoted, and of course this all depends on the league setup. Sponsorship comes once a year, usually in the summer, and it depends mostly on how much you win. Game receipts, merchandise, and all the rest of this stuff will only increase if you win. And then there's other. So nobody knows what other means. I don't think that Sports Interactive themselves actually know what other means, and that's what happens when your game turns into spaghetti code mess. Anyway, don't worry too much about other. If you win, you'll get more money, but you need more money in order to win. There are a few strategies you can pursue to try to get this balance out right. One is to refrain from buying older players, since the younger ones can usually be purchased for less money and tend to sign for lower value contracts. Now, if you want to be really extreme, you could simply not buy anybody and only use your youth academy. However, to get that to work right, you need to upgrade the youth facilities, which of course costs money. Well, you know, this is why we play the game. It's for the managerial balance. You need to know how much money to reinvest in the club and how much to use trying to make the club stronger. If you've ever tried playing with a team that has unlimited money, you know that the game will get really boring really fast. You need some kind of challenge. Now let's take a look at the expenses. Transfer expenditure is obvious. Those are your costs for buying players. Player wages and staff wages are obvious. I don't know much about non-football costs, nor do I really care. The youth setup is something I care a little bit more about. You do want to have enough money to pay for this. And then there are the scouting costs, which are something that you actually can control. Well, usually you want to have at least some scouting expenses, but there are things that you can do. For example, you can make sure that your scouts aren't looking at the same players over and over again. You can toggle it so that they only update the scouting reports when you ask them to. You don't want them to blow the entire scouting budget on travel either. There are some other tricks you can do, such as pulling players in for a trial for a few weeks to get a sneak peek at their attributes. That trick used to be really easy for 15 to 16-year-old new gens, but SI made it harder starting I think in 2022 or 2023, and honestly it's more realistic now. But it's still worth sinking some time into trial lists, especially if you think that somebody might be a hidden wonder kid. Next you have tax. Heaven help you here. Every country is different. Some people spend a lot of time researching realistic tax structures in order to make the game more realistic. Well, more power to you guys. I personally would never be able to survive digging in that deeply. There are other expenses here like ground maintenance, match day expenses, and so on. You won't be able to do much about those. You do want to try to get loan repayment costs down if you can. Having said that, it's not necessarily a good thing to have no loans out. I mean, you could go through the game without getting any sort of debt at all for your club, and honestly, if you're doing something like the Youth Academy Challenge like I am, you probably will never need to get a loan. But if you're playing the game the normal way, you likely will find yourself just short of money to get the right player. That's where the installment system comes into play. I recommend using it to stretch your club, but be careful. If you have a good idea of how much money you'll probably make over the course of the installments, you can get this figured out. And last but not least is Other. Now this one is controversial. There have been a number of threads in the official SI forums over the years about this. Some people think that this might be language costs for players who go to language school. Others think these costs will go up if you're promoted for whatever reason. Honestly, I think there's some sort of shadow algorithm that exists to keep you poor. Now, there's not a ton you can do about some of these expenses, but there are some that you can actually keep down if you know what you're doing. Well, a little while back, I created a North Korean team to play in the World Super League data file. I thought this would be a fun experiment. Not only were we awful for years in a row, but we also never had any money. My young players would start looking good and then would flatly refuse to sign new contracts. They weren't good enough for any other teams, and so they'd be free agents up until they'd retire at ages 19 or 20. Now, part of the problem is that I didn't give the team a high enough reputation. That's actually an important thing to note, though it's not technically finance related. You need your team to have a reputation at least somewhat similar to the other teams in your league. If there's a huge discrepancy, strange things are going to happen, and you might find yourself unable to ever win more than 5 or 6 games a season. The other problem, though, is our location, up in North Korea. We didn't have many options for friendlies, so I started scheduling away friendlies in other countries. However, the game does not tell you about the travel costs, and so we went into debt. That meant we didn't have enough money to maintain our youth setup, and nobody would buy our players since they weren't even good enough for the league that we were in. So the solution, be careful with friendlies. Only schedule home friendlies. You can make money that way. If you're traveling a long way for a friendly, the travel costs will eat you alive, especially if your team doesn't have much money. Also, when you use a custom database, do some research into it first. Now, World Super League is generally well done and will refund most travel costs. However, you do need to understand how things work before you jump in like I did. Well, one of the big issues with Football Manager is that a lot of this stuff is just hidden. The game doesn't come out and tell you about it. You learn it either the easy way or the hard way. But there are things you can do instead of just selling your star players to earn extra cash. If you have a lot of good young players, for example, you can create a loan army to make quite a bit of extra cash each season. There are other old tricks that still work, such as creating friendly league and cup competitions, getting a bunch of players in on trial, and having them play while your regulars rest. But you know, when all is said and done, the best policy is generally to win as many games as you can any way possible. If you win games and you stay out of transfer debt, your finances will usually be just fine. And if they're not, you might want to look under the hood, especially if you're using an editor data file, because something might be broken.